I have the great pleasure of offering a modest peek into the far-spanning career of Anatol Lieven, author, professor, Orwell Prize-winning journalist, policy analyst, to name a few. He is currently a professor at SFS Qatar and has held the position of Chair of International Relations and Terrorism at King's College renowned War Studies Department. He holds a BA in History, double first, and a PhD in Political Science from the University of Cambridge, rival, but we'll let that slide. He is a senior fellow at the New America Foundation in Washington, D.C., and previously worked as a senior associate of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His areas of expertise can be said to include Islamist terrorism and insurgency, contemporary warfare, US and Western strategy, countries of the Greater Middle East, and of course, countries of the former Soviet Union. He has testified before committees and subcommittees of the US Congress and the British Parliament. He has briefed the British government on Afghanistan, Pakistan. He has also spoken on numerous occasions at the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the US Department of State, the French Foreign Ministry, not to mention a wide range of American, European, Russian, Chinese universities and institutes. And important for us, he is also a prolific writer. From 1986 to 1998, he worked as a journalist in South Asia and the former Soviet Union. Not only is he persistently called upon to write for international media, but he has produced several influential books in our region of interest, including Chechnya, Tombstone of Russian Power, Ukraine and Russia, a fraternal rivalry. His book, The Baltic Revolution in particular, won the George Orwell Prize for Political Writing and the Yale University Press Governor's Award in 1993. It chronologizes the Baltics' cultural and political evolution and offers innovative insights into the Baltics' dual struggle of nation building and statehood consolidation after the Soviet Union's collapse. During his time in Washington in the early 2000s, he also produced works dealing with nationalism and ethical realism, and you'll see kind of all these different influences and their impact on the work we read for today. And so his most recent book, framing our discussion today, Change in the Nation State, published just last year, builds on his great experiences and prior works. It's a product, it was a product of flagrant necessity as he offers new insights on a global and persistent issue and places it, importantly, the nexus of national security and climate change. And from a decidedly realist viewpoint, he argues that climate change should be framed in nationalist terms as an existential threat to states' national security. And he advocates for harnessing this unparalleled messaging potential of nationalism as a productive, mobilizing, and unifying force. And that it has a unique potential, I think, to resonate with entire peoples, simultaneously rooted in the past and present. So extremely innovative, and I look forward to this discussion. So I think I speak for us all when say we can now clap.
I'm delighted. Well, actually, I can't say that I'm here because I'm not. I'm in Qatar, but I'm delighted to be with you spiritually. And to see Michael again, who's down in the corner. Yes, forgive the lighting and the echo. I'm actually in the process of moving from Qatar, where I am now, ultimately to Washington, where I'm joining the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I'm going to be their Russia and Europe guy, but I will also obviously be covering climate change. As you may have gathered from the introduction, I often tell my students, or told them while I still had students, that having spent many years as a journalist and then at think tanks, I could teach everything except marriage and car maintenance. So please don't ask me any questions about either of those things, but as Margarita was kind enough to say, I could talk about so much else. Now, I suppose in a way I'm a funny sort of convert to the cause of climate change action, or at least I would have been in the past. I come from the field of contemporary journalism, international affairs, security studies, and realist thought on the conduct of international affairs. I like to call my version of it ethical realism, derived from the thinking of Reinhold Niebuhr, Hans Morgenthau, George Kennan, and others. Many people disagree with the ethical bit, but anyway. But I think, like a number of other people, many people now, who are moving into the area of, well, concern about climate change, although not an environmentalist by intellectual tradition, I have simply been convinced by the evidence, by the scientific consensus on the subject, and frankly, by the absolutely implausible and unconvincing intellectual gyrations you have to make, the knots you have to tie yourself into, in order to claim that anthropogenic climate change is not happening and that it's not driven by carbon emissions into the atmosphere. The evidence is simply overwhelming now, and the correlation between temperature rises and carbon emissions seems to me simply incontrovertible. And the science of this has been established since for more than 150 years. It's nobody has ever tried to challenge the basic science of it. It can't be. I mean, of course, you can challenge it from a standpoint of creationism, or as an Indian official once told me, if it's not in the Bhagavad Gita, it doesn't exist. Well, you can try to challenge it from that point of view, but not, in my view, successfully. As the old song has it, you don't have to be a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. And once again, you see a number of different people now, a fair number in the military even, certainly leading economists like Nicholas Stern, who are now taking climate change very seriously as an existential threat if we do not succeed in limiting and checking it. So that's the first thing. I have been convinced by the evidence. The second thing that happened to me was that I then began to compare, to some extent, the impact of climate change that is happening already. I don't know how many of you are actually in California, but of course, if you look up the coast, a few hundred miles, and look at what's happening up there in Washington and in British Columbia, you see a disaster in the making. But also, of course, the projected future impacts. But I mean, of course, one must not be exact about this. That would be completely wrong. One must not make exact predictions. But once again, there is so much evidence that if we fail to keep climate change within certain limits, the effects on human society, all states, will vary depending on the scale and the speed, from the very bad to the cataclysmic. And in the last resort, if we get into this business of tipping points, feedback loops, release of methane from the Arctic, permafrost then drives 2 degrees to 3 degrees to 4 degrees to 5 degrees, it is entirely plausible to imagine the destruction of modern civilization and the greater part of human life on Earth. This was, these are longer term projections, but as Marguerite was kind enough to mention, I spent many years in South Asia, first as a student, then as a journalist, then as a researcher, written a book on Pakistan called Pakistan, a Hard Country. And if you look at South Asia, and you bring together the threat of climate change with already very high temperatures, in other words, the margin for safe change is much less. If you look at increasing water stress, drought in North India and Pakistan, monstrous overuse of water and population growth, then, as predicted by the World Bank and other institutions, you can see the possibility, even the likelihood, of a major crisis beginning already by the middle of this century. The World Bank projection is that if we continue on our existing trajectory, Indian economic growth will go into reverse by 2050 as a result of this combination of factors, but with climate change as the new driving element. And what this brought home to me was the fact that in my world, or my previous world, because I suspect, well, I haven't been exactly expelled from it, but I've noticed a certain coolness, shall we say, in certain circles, in my world of security studies, that the greater part of what they spend their time obsessively worrying about will be seen by the historians of the future, if there are any, as almost bizarrely irrelevant and minor by comparison to the threat of climate change. And in my book, I talk about sort of epiphany I had when reading yet another piece about the Chinese occupation of these reefs and sandbanks in the South China Sea. Because I suddenly thought, hang on a second. Well, of course, the Chinese too are obsessed with claiming these reefs and sandbanks. We are obsessed with the threat this poses to us. If even the medium projections for climate change and sea level rise come about, already by 100 years or so from now, this will be a non-issue because they will all be underwater again. These are not islands, remember, they're reefs and sandbanks. Of course, or maybe the Chinese will be prepared to pour enormous amounts of concrete and steel and sand, and of course money, into the South China Sea to keep these places going. But it will certainly not be viable as long-term strategic bases. And you might say that therefore the West has a strong incentive to encourage the Chinese to throw money into the water. They, you know, if they want to waste their money in this way, no skin off our noses, right? But the point is that since the Korean War, China has not killed a single American. Indirectly from Vietnam, yeah, okay. Similarly with Russia, since the end of the Cold War, beyond. And neither of these countries threatens the existence of the American state. You can claim that there is a certain attempt to subvert the American political order, but let us be honest, our own societies are doing an excellent job of that. If you look at America, Europe, you know, they don't need much help from outside. None of the threats, even terrorism without weapons of mass destruction, about which our security elites are so concerned, begins to compare to the long-term threat of climate change to our states and our societies. And it struck me that we are suffering from something which has been called residual elites. That is to say, we are governed, especially in the area of foreign and security policy, by elites who are shaped, especially by the Cold War, of course, but also by, of course, hundreds and thousands of years of security concerns, to be concerned with, to work against a particular set of challenges. And they are simply not equipped, institutionally, intellectually, even morally, to confront the new challenges, the real challenges of today and the time to come. And it struck me that it is useful in this context, on the one hand, to cast our minds forward 100 years or 120 years or so, and to imagine, as I say, what the historians of the future will think. But I think it's also useful to cast our minds back 110 years or so to the period before the First World War. Because before the First World War, the elites of every European country, every European great power, were absolutely convinced that the greatest threat to them, to their states, to their countries, was from other great powers. And of course, they armed, they mobilized, they formed alliances against this, and those alliances eventually dragged them into the First World War. Turned out, of course, they were utterly wrong. The biggest threat to them and to European civilization was from within. It was the internal forces in the Russian Empire and later in Germany, which the First World War released, which were the catastrophic threat to European civilization, and very nearly destroyed that civilization. They got it completely wrong. And looking back, we can see that with the benefit of hindsight. Now, I'm absolutely convinced that if we cast our minds forward into the next century, the argument that the historians will think that these islands in the South China Sea, or the Russian occupation of Crimea or eastern Ukraine, was the biggest threat to the United States or Europe, that is a ridiculous, that is an absurd assumption. I mean, of course, if we stumble into a nuclear war, yes, but then there won't be any historians, so it doesn't really matter. But I really think, in terms of the evidence about the likely impact of climate change, unchecked climate change, you really only have to cast your mind forward in this way, and you can see what our descendants are going to think about us, or at least about the people governing us, if we go on in this way. Now, oh, and by the way, I mean, obviously the book is directed towards Western security elites, but its arguments are completely applicable to those of the government of China, of India, of Russia, Brazil, what have you. Indeed, more applicable to the governments of China and India because they are more immediately threatened by this than we are. I'll come back to that. Now, casting your mind forward into the next century, of course, automatically raises one of the critical issues and critical challenges for climate change action, which is this business of the need to ask present generation and the next one to make sacrifices for generations to come down the line. Now, that ought to be easier, as I say, in India and South Asia, because the threat is much more imminent. For us, in the West, the direct impact, although, you know, if you live in Vancouver, it's there already, or in Australia, but the really catastrophic direct impacts will not kick in over the next generation, so it will take more time. So there is this question, how do you get present generations to make sacrifices for future generations? And this has led to, you know, some, to me, frankly, well, perhaps not so much, I mean, yes, bizarre, but also morally bizarre. I mean, there is a degree of decadence about this, if you will, for me, a fundamental immorality that I find it difficult to get my mind around. It's this business of discounting. How do you adjust, in economic terms, the interests of future generations against the present generation? And as Nicholas Stern has pointed out in his works on this subject, once you get into this business, you very often end up with calculations about the interests of, you know, 4 generations from now being worth 1/100th or 1/300th or 1,000th of the interests of people living today. Now, what that basically means is our descendants can go to hell. We don't give a damn. We really just don't give a damn. They can starve, they can disappear underwater, they can boil. We don't give a damn. We'd rather go on, you know, flying as much as we like, driving as much as we like, paying, you know, minimal, or by historic standards, minimal prices for energy and so on. Now, this is, however, a very real problem because the sacrifices that will be required are real, it seems to me. If you read some of the environmentalist press, there is this suggestion that, oh no, you know, actually fairly limited state actions will take care of things, and others, in my view, I think much more accurately, think that the sacrifices required will be high. If you read pieces in the Financial Times, for example, in terms of course, higher fuel prices, in terms of carbon taxes and their impact, possibly in future in terms of rationing of travel. And unfortunately, what we have seen is that almost always, not quite always, but almost always, when this has been put squarely to Western populations in the form of referenda, as in Washington State of the USA twice now, in France with Macron's carbon tax, a number of other places as well, a majority of the population has said no. We don't want it. Now, of course, in terms of relative threat and relative concentration, the contrast here is quite simply astounding, because the average American pays more than $2,000 a year in taxes for a defense establishment, which, in my view, exists largely to defend America against non-existent threats by now, or minor threats. It does not exist to defend the American homeland. It doesn't. It just doesn't. There is no threat to the American homeland, except from terrorism. And yet people are unwilling to pay, you know, there have been opinion polls on this, they're unwilling to pay even as much, you know, or rather as little as 1/500th of that in order to combat climate change. Once again, I mean, a total mismatch, a misunderstanding of priorities. And once again, I think one does have to take issue here with parts of the environmentalist left, because when I was researching for this book on climate change, you know, every now and again I would come across phrases like, you know, the entire problem of anthropogenic climate change is created by 20 capitalist corporations. Nonsense. We are all implicated in this. I have the air conditioning on. Well, I have to, living in Qatar. I'd boil, I'd be dead by now. Burning lights. Yes, I have an SUV for safety. If you don't in Qatar, I promise you I'm not going to drive one when I get to Washington. I promise you that. And of course I fly everywhere. Given up various things, but I know very well, you know, my grandchildren are going to say, I haven't given up nearly enough, not nearly enough. We are all implicated in this, because we are all part of this economy that generates very nice things for us. And we're all going to have to give certain things up in the future. And the question becomes, how do you get people to do that? Now, there is one additional thing on that, which is in terms of the mismatch of priorities and the mismatch of risks, which is nuclear energy, which is not usually seen in these terms. But I am a strong ally of James Lovelock and David Wallace Wells. Sorry, which Wallace Wells? I get them mixed up. I think it's David. In terms of the argument that closing down nuclear power stations before alternative energy is fully there and is fully technologically developed, especially in terms of storage, to take its place, is a complete misunderstanding. Well, it's a betrayal of action against climate change, because of course, whatever else it does, nuclear energy doesn't generate carbon emissions, but it also totally misunderstands risk, not just the risk of climate change, but actual physical risks. As Wallace Wells has pointed out, at the absolute outside, the biggest estimate for indirect deaths as a result of Chernobyl, 60,000. Most estimates are far, far below that. Fukushima, nothing. Between 7 and 9 million people die each year as a result of air pollution generated above all by carbon emissions. 7 to 9 million, do the math. But when it comes to climate change, even more, you know, as has been pointed out about California and other places as well, you shut down nuclear energy before alternative energy can fully compensate. You are setting yourself up for the kind of electricity shortages which not merely turn people against climate change action, but, as a recent piece from the Financial Times pointed out, turn more and more people towards diesel generators as an energy insurance policy. As the FT said, that is beginning to make parts of America look more like India or Pakistan, where the rich have generators at home because they can't, and because the military, because they can't rely on the national grid because it keeps breaking down, especially in summer. Now, of course, this is dreadful in terms of social differentiation, in terms of social solidarity. But of course, the diesel generators, what do? They pump more carbon emissions into the atmosphere. So, one of the things, it's not just about costs, it's also about being willing to run a certain, very limited amount of extra risk from nuclear accidents. Very willing to respond to that and answer to questions, because I know it's a controversial point. Now, these perceptions led me in two directions. The first is of course more and more common. It was the central campaign platform of the person who I really wanted to win the presidency, which is Elizabeth Warren. The book does not actually say that, but you don't have to read it too carefully to see that she was my candidate. And that is the idea of a Green New Deal. In other words, the only way that you're going to be able to get people to accept these sacrifices, voters to accept these sacrifices in the West, but you know, ordinary people in Russia and China as well, is if there is a strengthened social security and social solidarity to compensate populations for these sacrifices. And secondly, if there is some extra element, some very visible extra element of common sacrifice. In other words, the rich have got to pay more taxes. Macron's carbon tax was in itself an excellent and absolutely necessary move. But to combine this with his program of free market reforms and deregulation was politically crazy and had the inevitable result of the yellow vest, the Gilets jaunes uprising by ordinary French people who did not see why the great weight of this sacrifice was going to fall on them, and the upper classes were not going to make any additional sacrifices at all. If it comes, to the point of where we actually have to restrict travel, or where, of course, simply the prices of travel go up. If I couldn't fly around the world seeing my friends and doing my job, I would be extremely unhappy. I would accept it. I would accept this if it took the form of basically wartime rationing. In other words, everybody's right to travel, to air travel, is restricted equally. But if ordinary people are denied the right to air travel, while the billionaires go on buzzing over our heads on their holidays, that is a recipe for the breakdown of the system, and ultimately, by the way, for revolution. People will not stand for that, ultimately. So, common sacrifice. Starting, but when it comes to solidarity, of course, and here I do worry a bit about the way in which Biden's program has taken shape. Of course, I supported absolutely, in principle, his infrastructure program. But it's terribly important that it go in the first instance to compensating and supporting the people who are in the first instance going to lose their jobs as a result of the shift from fossil fuels. Looking back to Britain in the 1980s, as somebody concerned about climate change, you simply have to approve of Margaret Thatcher's closing down of the British coal industry, because it simply had to happen sooner or later. What was a disaster that has scarred British life and Northern England to this day and had all manner of malignant consequences, including in part Brexit, is the fact that this was done with no concern to compensate the miners and the communities who were losing their jobs. The result was a social catastrophe from which Britain has not recovered. So they had to go, but there had to be a way of compensating the miners and the large areas of England for what happened. Them first. Say the same thing about West Virginia and so on. So that's the Green New Deal. Incidentally, I would urge all of you who haven't read it already to read a new book by Robert Putnam and some associates called The Upswing, which tracks the pattern of what he calls we thinking in America, social solidarity thinking, and I, or me thinking, over the past 140 odd years. Because what this brings out is that, I mean, admittedly for a particular set of historical reasons, it is, over the long periods, it is possible radically to change the attitudes in America. Europe has not, it's been a flatter curve. Back to thinking in terms of social solidarity, national solidarity, and not just in terms of penalising the rich, but also in terms of changing the attitudes of the rich. And he has this extraordinary reference to Mitt Romney's father, who of course was a very big executive for General Motors, chief executive officer, chairman. He refused to take bonuses. He lost millions of dollars because he would not take bonuses. He didn't approve of executive pay rising exponentially out of sync with that of the workers. And he restricted the pay of executives. Now, the contrast between him and his son could hardly be more stark. But the point is, the father was shaped by a different social morality in America in the first half and middle of the 20th century. Of course, this was also due to the fact that as an industrial executive, he did feel a responsibility to his workers and to the cities where they lived, which of course no hedge fund manager feels. So it's also part of financialization, but it does also show a radical change in social morality among the rich at that time, which we then subsequently lost. So, Green New Deal, so far, so familiar by now, so much thinking along these lines. But the second point that I was led to, as Marguerite alluded to in the title of the book, is the role of nationalism. Or patriotism, to give it a nicer word, but for me this is a distinction without a meaning. What I call civic nationalism is what Americans and Brits call patriotism. But in India, where I spent a number of years starting as a student, all my Indian liberal friends regarded themselves as nationalists, Nehruite civic liberal nationalists. Well, that's true for India. If I were in India, I too would be a civic nationalist. Not, of course, a Modi-style Hindu chauvinist nationalist. That's the difference. But anyway, and there have been quite a lot of books by now by people like Yael Tamir saying that, yeah, civic nationalism, good. Now, why nationalism? Well, the first point was this whole business of sacrifice for the future. And the difficulty of getting people to sacrifice for future generations. Well, here, of course, the nation plays a tremendous part, or could do, should do. Because as Milan Kundera, the Czech novelist, wrote, sorry, referring to my book. Oh, by the way, the paperback edition of the book is coming out in America in September the 1st, updated to take account of the COVID pandemic and its lessons. So as Milan Kundera wrote, a man knows that he is mortal, but he takes for granted that his nation possesses a kind of eternal life. Of course, it isn't eternal life, but it is certainly, it is impossible to conceive of the idea of a nation or a state for only one generation. That is absurd. It just doesn't work that way. And as I often point out, the Great Seal of the United States, the motto, does not read, the US Constitution is like 10 minutes ago. It reads Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order for the ages. In other words, America embodies certain values, the US Constitution, American way of life, which are to be passed on, hopefully, for centuries to come. And there is, of course, a famous environmentalist slogan that we have only borrowed the world from our grandchildren. But when you think about it, that is actually very close to Edmund Burke's famous dictum that society is a contract between the living, the dead, our forefathers, and those yet to be born. In other words, a continuity of society and nations through time. I thought a rather striking and amusing thing here, and if you've come across it, this idea of 6th generation thinking, or was it 12th generation thinking, or 8, I can't remember exactly how many, which has been attributed to the Iroquois nation, the Native American, Native Canadian nation, who supposedly had this idea that you have to think 6 generations ahead, or however much it was. I have a nasty suspicion that this may be an invention. I did actually look through the statutes of the Iroquois Confederation. I couldn't find it, but okay, it's a nice idea. Let's assume that they really did have something like this. Well, anyone who knows the Iroquois, oh sure, thinking about 6 generations of Iroquois, not 6 generations of anybody else, believe me. Ask the Huron or their other neighbors. The Iroquois, I'm perfectly willing to accept they thought deeply about the interests of the Iroquois. I've never heard they gave a damn for the interests of anybody else, except perhaps. Won't go down that road. But the point is, on the whole, all the evidence suggests people care first and foremost about those closest to them and about their own societies. And the further out you get, the less that kicks in. So nationalism as a force for sacrifice for future generations, that is the first point. And the second point about the appeal of nationalism is that the more I thought about the need for climate change action and the Green New Deal, the more it became clear to me that to get this through, I mean, really on the scale required, we need not just to win elections, we need a transformation of the political scene, what has been called in American history a new political dispensation, of the kind which Franklin Delano Roosevelt achieved with the New Deal in the 1930s, though as Putnam and his colleagues bring out, on the basis of a transformation in American thinking which had actually been going on for 30 years before that through the progressive movement, by the way, in the Republican Party as well as the Democrats. And this new dispensation created by Roosevelt, by FDR, actually by Teddy Roosevelt as well, a generation before, and the Green New Deal meant that for 50 years almost after the New Deal was introduced, Republican presidents governed like New Deal Democrats. Eisenhower, a Republican, totally accepted the New Deal. and not just in the New Deal social solidarity in itself, but also accepted the need for massive state involvement in the economy in certain respects, to develop the economy in ways that served the country, the nation, its interests as a whole. Nixon, actually, same thing. Whatever you think about the rest of what Nixon did, he governed internally as a New Deal Democrat, except, of course, not on racial issues, but on social issues, even environmental issues. Then, of course, the early 1980s, Reagan reverses things and creates a new dispensation, whereby the next two Democrat presidents, Clinton and Obama, in effect, govern like more moderate versions of Reaganite Republicans. Same thing with Tony Blair in Britain. And it seems to me that and to do this, you had to achieve big majorities, much bigger majorities than Biden achieved, unfortunately, at the last elections. And of course, the important thing in the United States is you've got to win majorities that give you overwhelming dominance of the Senate, of Congress. And you've got to keep yourself in power for long enough, radically to change the Supreme Court, which of course is now a disaster, right, for the foreseeable future. It's not enough just to squeak through the Electoral College. If we want really radical action to limit climate change, we need a new dispensation. Now, that's the second point about nationalism and also about appealing to the security elites. Because for that, it's absolutely obvious, you need to appeal to conservative voters, not the absolute hardliners there. Beyond the reach of reason, I feel. But you've got to appeal to sufficient conservative voters, or at least Republican voters, to create that kind of majority. Now, that means appealing to them in terms that they can understand and sympathize with. It's like Jonathan Haidt, or Haidt, I'm not sure how to pronounce him, wrote this famous book about how you want really to change people's minds or get them to do things. You appeal to the elephant. The elephant is their political subconscious, if you like, not the rider, who is their sort of conscious mind on top. And so it seemed to me that appealing in terms of nationalism is one way to do that, and appealing in terms of security threats from climate change to the nation, the American nation, the Russian, the Indian, the Chinese, is the way, or is one way, that we have to go if we are to succeed in creating this, this new dispensation. And from that point of view, we have to do something, I'm afraid, which the left and liberals absolutely hate, which is you do have to concentrate people's minds on migration. We have already seen how over the past, well, less than a generation, 10 years or so, fears of immigration have driven disastrous political developments in both America and Europe. Of course, they're not the only factor, but look at the opinion polls, there's not much doubt about that. Now, so far, these movements have been limited, although they're growing. But you look at the likely impact of climate change, and here, once again, we are not talking about the 22nd century, we're talking about the next generations. On South Asia and West Africa, for example, it is extremely likely that you will see if we cannot check climate change, you'll see movements of people which will either overturn our political orders, well, whichever way it goes, they'll overturn our political orders because the reaction against them will be such as to destroy liberal democracy in the West. I pray, of course, that doesn't happen, but I do not think it is possible to deny that that is a plausible scenario. Incidentally, worth pointing out on that score, of course, everybody who discusses this issue in the West, fairly enough, I suppose, talks about the West. The most ruthlessly policed frontier in the world against migrants, I mean, except, of course, if you take North Korea, which is keeping them in, is the Indian border against Bangladesh. More than 1,100 people shot dead by Indian border guards over the past 12 years, I think, 15 years. And the Indians are building a massively fortified fence around Bangladesh. Why? Well, partly, of course, and by the way, this started under Congress, not under Modi, though, of course, Modi's fear of Muslim migration has helped to drive it, because of profound fears that poverty and climate change in Bangladesh will lead to huge movements of Bangladeshis into India, destabilizing the political, the ethno-religious order, and, of course, adding to poverty among the Indian poor. There's India worrying about this, for very good reasons. Oh, and by the way, completely unapologetically, if you ask the Indians on the subject, they have no conscience. Their conscience is concentrated on themselves, not on the Bangladeshis, like the Iroquois. Now, as you can probably imagine, the reaction to the book has been decidedly mixed. On the whole, as I say, my old colleagues in the security world have basically ignored it, not totally, but they absolutely detest it. Look, I understand perfectly. I'm basically saying that their jobs are redundant. They are, they're barking up completely the wrong tree. That all this business of, and that we shouldn't be spending money on them. Nobody's going to like that. I didn't really expect it. And of course, the environmentalist left absolutely detests the idea of nationalism, and appealing to nationalism. And I have to say, in part of what I, some of the sharper edges perhaps of the book, were driven by the number of books and essays I read while researching for the book, which basically said that if we are to do, well, I mean, two things. One is, Naomi Klein and company, the only way of doing anything about climate change is to abolish capitalism. Well, good luck on that one. I mean, of course it may well happen. Climate change itself may very well destroy capitalism over the next couple of 100 years, but it will destroy everything else in the process. But if you're looking for rapid action against climate change, then the idea that you're going to have a revolution that will destroy capitalism first, that is a recipe for not doing anything until it's much too late. Any effective action, as with the welfare state, as with milder forms of pollution control and health measures in the past, came about through the reform of capitalism, not expecting capitalism to reform itself. If we'd left it to capitalism to reform itself, you'd still have 6-year-old children working in coal mines. That's not going to happen. The state has to lead, but equally, it has to reshape capitalism. It did it before, frankly, because we were so afraid of that if we didn't, or if the capitalists became afraid that if we didn't, we'd have either communism or Nazism. It was the effect of what happened in the first half of the 20th century. I hope that we can do that again through fear of climate change, but the state has to lead. So that's the first thing. But the second thing I had to read so much of were phrases like the cancer of Westphalia, to combat climate change, we have to abolish the nation state. Go and say that to Xi Jinping, the Chinese Communist Party, Putin, Narendra Modi. Seriously? I mean, seriously? This is a practical program for action against climate change. But of course in America too. Biden, and I understand why, although I can't bring myself to approve, is of course very much trying to justify his infrastructure program precisely in terms of American competition with China, strengthening the American nation state against China and external rivals. And he and his team think that that is the best way to do it. I would very much prefer not to do it that way, but of one thing I'm absolutely certain. It's that going to Washington, D.C. and saying that you're going to abolish America as a nation state is not going to get you very far. And when I lived in Washington before, between 2000 and 2007, I was astonished at the Carnegie Endowment, liberal establishment think tank. All these people talking about globalization and the decline of the nation state. It wasn't just that they were surrounded by images of American national power and identity, state identity, glory, and so forth. But their own highest ambition in life was at some point in future to become the chief deputy assistant to the Secretary of State for dog washing in the next American administration. That was the summit of their ideal in life. How could you bring this together with the idea that globalization was going to abolish the nation state? And then a light came on over my head. Of course, globalization was going to lead to them and people like them running the world. Liberal Americans, elites, and other people, of course, no, genuinely other people in other countries, but who were like the American elites and listened to them absolutely well. They don't see things the same way in China or India or elsewhere, and especially in the former colonial world, nations that struggled very hard to get rid of Western colonialism are not going to surrender those state powers to some international government, nor is anybody else. So, not for one single moment am I against Extinction Rebellion. I've actually commissioned Extinction Rebellion to write some things, or Greenpeace, or Greta Thunberg, or any of these things. But let us face it, and I'm certainly not against international treaties, absolutely not, totally in favour of them. But let's face it, international agreements and international movements are there in order to get states to act, in order to persuade electorates and leaders, governments of states to take action. The Paris Agreement in itself can do nothing. The United Nations on its own can do nothing. None of these movements can do anything in themselves. They are there to get states to act. So the whole point of my book, updated, as I say, to take account of COVID, which has in some ways, I think, been, I hate to say a positive thing, but at least it's really accustomed people to massive, once again, to massive state intervention in the economy, which I think is a very, very good thing for action against climate change. What I hoped it would do would also really alert people to the fact that there are other threats, unconventional threats, if you like, which simply overwhelm in terms of impact the sort of thing that our security elites worry about. And just to make a familiar point, COVID over the past year has killed more Americans than all the wars of the 20th century put together, and is on its way to kill more people than the American Civil War, greatest war in American history. Now, I had really, really hoped that that would, have an impact on the thinking of our security elites about the real threats to our people. Because remember, in the end, American security is, British security is, or should be, about defending American citizens, the lives of American citizens. As I've said, say again and again, when it comes to the lives, the well-being of American citizens, even today, but more and more in future, climate change leaves everything else standing. Thank you. I'm now delighted to hear your questions.